The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Compound as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her barracks. At 26, she had already broken more barriers than most people would in a lifetime. Her sandy blonde hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, and her green eyes held the same steely determination that had carried her through years of rigorous training to become one of the first women to earn the coveted SEAL Trident. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Montana, where her father ran a construction company and her mother worked as a nurse. From an early age, she had shown an unusual combination of physical prowess and mental toughness. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, Sarah was climbing trees, building forts, and challenging the neighborhood boys to races she almost always won. Her parents, both supportive and somewhat bewildered by their daughter's fierce independence, had encouraged her pursuits even when they didn't fully understand them. The path to becoming a SEAL had been anything but easy. After graduating from the Naval Academy with honors, Sarah had volunteered for the grueling Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training Program, known simply as BUD/S. The 6-month course had a notorious dropout rate of over 80%, designed to weed out all but the most determined and capable candidates. Sarah had not only survived but excelled, finishing in the top 10% of her class. Her success, however, had come at a personal cost. The intense training schedule left little time for relationships or a normal social life. Many of her former friends from the academy had drifted away, unable to understand her single-minded focus on a career that most considered impossible for women. Even her family, though proud, sometimes struggled to connect with the person she had become through her transformation into elite warrior. The integration of women into SEAL teams was still a controversial and evolving process. While the military had officially opened all combat roles to women, the reality on the ground was far more complex. Many of the men in the teams had spent their entire careers in an exclusively male environment, and some were skeptical about whether women could truly meet the physical and mental demands of special operations. Sarah understood their concerns, even if she didn't agree with them. She knew that every mistake she made would be scrutinized more heavily than those of her male counterparts. Every show of weakness would be seen as evidence that women didn't belong in the teams. The pressure was immense, but she had learned to channel it into motivation rather than allowing it to become a burden. As she made her way to the mess hall for breakfast, Sarah reflected on the events that had led her to this point. Her first operational deployment had been to Afghanistan, where she had served as part of a joint task force conducting counterterrorism operations. The mission had been successful, but it had also been her first real taste of how some of her fellow SEALs viewed her presence in their ranks. Most of the men she served with were professional and respectful, recognizing her skills and contributions to the team. However, there were always a few who seemed to view her as either a curiosity or an unwelcome intrusion into their brotherhood. She had learned to ignore the whispered comments and sideways glances, focusing instead on proving herself through her actions and performance. The mess hall was already crowded when Sarah entered, filled with the usual morning chatter of personnel grabbing quick breakfasts before beginning their daily training routines. She moved through the serving line efficiently, selecting a simple meal of scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. The food at the base was functional rather than gourmet, designed to fuel the intense physical demands of special operations training rather than provide culinary pleasure. Finding an empty table near the back of the hall, Sarah sat down and began eating while reviewing some technical manuals she had brought with her. She was studying new underwater demolition techniques that the team would be practicing later that week. Staying current with the latest tactics and equipment was crucial in special operations, where technological advances could mean the difference between mission success and failure. As she read, she became aware of a group of new recruits at a nearby table. They were fresh-faced young men who had just begun the selection process for SEAL training. Their conversation, initially quiet, gradually became louder and more boisterous as they gained confidence from being in a group. Sarah tried to ignore them, but their voices carried clearly across the small space between tables. The recruits were discussing their upcoming training schedule, comparing notes about different instructors, and sharing rumors about what to expect in the coming weeks. Their excitement and nervousness were evident, reminding Sarah of her own feelings during the early days of her training. She remembered the mixture of anticipation and terror that had characterized those first few weeks, when everything was new and the standards seemed impossibly high. One of the recruits, a tall young man with close-cropped brown hair, was holding forth about his expectations for the program. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never truly been tested, making bold predictions about how he would handle the various challenges ahead. His companions listened with a mixture of admiration and skepticism, clearly impressed by his bravado, but perhaps wondering if he could back up his words with actions. As their conversation continued, Sarah noticed that their topics gradually shifted from training to more general discussions about the SEAL community. They began talking about famous operations, legendary SEALs from the past, and their own hopes for future deployments. It was the kind of conversation that was common among new recruits, a way of building camaraderie, while also establishing pecking orders within their informal group. The brown-haired recruit, who seemed to have appointed himself the leader of their little group, began sharing what he claimed was inside information about recent changes to SEAL team compositions. His voice took on a more serious tone as he discussed the integration of women into special operations roles. Sarah's attention was immediately drawn to his words, though she continued to appear focused on her reading. According to the recruit, whose name appeared to be Jackson based on the name tape visible on his uniform, the addition of women to SEAL teams was nothing more than a political stunt designed to appease critics of the military's traditional male-only policies. He argued that women simply lacked the physical strength and mental toughness necessary for special operations work, and that their presence in the teams would inevitably lead to reduced standards and increased casualties. His companions nodded along with varying degrees of enthusiasm, some clearly buying into his arguments while others seemed less certain. Sarah could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they glanced around the mess hall as if worried about being overheard. They were new enough to the community that they hadn't yet formed their own opinions, making them susceptible to the kind of authoritative-sounding pronouncements that Jackson was delivering. Jackson continued his monologue, describing what he claimed were documented cases of women failing to meet physical standards or requiring special accommodations during training. Sarah knew that some of his claims were outright falsehoods, while others were gross exaggerations of isolated incidents that had been blown out of proportion by critics of the integration policy. However, she also recognized that confronting him directly would likely escalate the situation in ways that wouldn't benefit anyone. As she listened to the one-sided conversation, Sarah felt a familiar mixture of frustration and sadness. She had heard these arguments countless times before, from politicians opposing the integration policy, from media commentators looking for controversial talking points, and unfortunately, from some members of the military community itself. The arguments rarely acknowledged the extensive research and careful planning that had gone into the integration process, or the rigorous standards that women had to meet in order to qualify for special operations roles. What bothered Sarah most was not the existence of these opinions themselves, but the casual way they were often expressed, as if the women who had earned their places in special operations were not real people with real accomplishments, but rather abstract concepts to be debated. She thought about the sacrifices she had made to reach this point, the years of training and preparation, the physical and emotional challenges she had overcome, and the pride she felt in wearing the SEAL trident. Jackson's voice grew more animated as he warmed to his subject, describing what he saw as the inevitable consequences of lowering standards to accommodate women. He painted a picture of mission failures, team cohesion breaking down, and the proud traditions of the SEAL community being diluted in the name of political correctness. His audience continued to listen, though Sarah noticed that some of them were beginning to look uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. One of the younger recruits, a slight young man with red hair and freckles, tentatively raised a question about whether Jackson had actually served with any women in combat roles. The question seemed to catch Jackson off guard for a moment, and Sarah saw a flash of uncertainty cross his face before he recovered his composure. He admitted that he hadn't yet deployed operationally, but claimed that his information came from reliable sources within the SEAL community. Sarah knew that Jackson's reliable sources were likely nothing more than internet forums and secondhand stories, the kind of information that got distorted and exaggerated with each retelling. The reality was that the integration of women into special operations had been carefully planned and implemented, with extensive support systems and monitoring to ensure that standards were maintained. The women who had successfully completed SEAL training had done so under exactly the same standards as their male counterparts, with no accommodations or reduced requirements. As she continued to listen, Sarah found herself thinking about her teammates and the bonds she had formed during her deployments. The men she served with had come to respect her not because of her gender, but despite it, recognizing that she brought valuable skills and perspectives to their operations. They had seen her perform under pressure, watched her handle the physical and mental demands of combat, and witnessed her dedication to the mission and to her fellow SEALs. The conversation at the recruits' table was beginning to attract attention from other personnel in the mess hall. Sarah noticed several senior personnel glancing in their direction, their expressions ranging from mild annoyance to obvious disapproval. She knew that Jackson was digging himself into a hole that would likely have consequences for his future in the program, assuming he made it that far. Military training, especially in special operations, was as much about character and judgment as it was about physical capabilities. Instructors were constantly evaluating recruits not just on their ability to complete specific tasks, but on their maturity, their ability to work as part of a team, and their understanding of the values that define the military profession. Jackson's public display of prejudice and ignorance was exactly the kind of behavior that would raise red flags among the training staff. Despite her frustration with Jackson's comments, Sarah found herself feeling somewhat sorry for him. He was young and inexperienced, probably repeating opinions he had absorbed from others without really thinking through their implications. She remembered being his age and having strong opinions about subjects she didn't fully understand. The difference was that her opinions hadn't been based on prejudice against an entire group of people who had earned their right to be there. As she finished her breakfast, Sarah made a decision about how to handle the situation. She could simply ignore Jackson's comments and go about her day, allowing him to continue spreading misinformation to his impressionable audience. Alternatively, she could confront him directly, though she knew from experience that such confrontations rarely changed anyone's mind and often just led to increased hostility. Instead, she chose a third option. Rising from her table, she walked over to where the recruits were sitting, her presence immediately commanding attention. The conversation stopped abruptly as the young men realized that someone was approaching their table, and Sarah could see the recognition dawning in their eyes as they noticed the SEAL trident on her uniform. Standing quietly beside their table, Sarah looked directly at Jackson, her expression calm but serious. She didn't speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch out as the recruits grew increasingly uncomfortable. Around them, the noise level in the mess hall seemed to drop as other personnel became aware of the developing situation. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying easily to everyone at the table and several nearby. She didn't introduce herself or explain why she was there, assuming correctly that her presence and uniform would make her identity and purpose obvious. Instead, she simply asked Jackson a single question that would challenge everything he had just said and force him to confront the reality of his situation. The question hung in the air between them, simple but devastating in its implications. Sarah waited patiently for his response, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the obvious nervousness that had suddenly gripped the entire table of recruits. Sarah's question was simple and direct. What exactly makes you think you're qualified to judge who belongs in this community when you haven't even made it through your first week of training? The silence that followed was profound. Jackson's face went through several color changes, from his normal complexion to pale white, then to a deep red as the implications of her words sank in. Around the table, his companions shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly finding their breakfast trays fascinating subjects of study. The casual confidence that had characterized their conversation just moments before evaporated completely. Sarah remained standing beside their table, her posture relaxed but alert. She had learned long ago that the most effective confrontations were often the quietest ones, where the power of carefully chosen words could accomplish more than any amount of shouting or aggressive behavior. Her question had exposed the fundamental flaw in Jackson's argument. He was making definitive statements about subjects he had no actual experience with. Jackson struggled to formulate a response, his mouth opening and closing several times without producing any sound. Sarah could see him cycling through possible answers in his mind, each one revealing new problems with his position. He could try to double down on his original arguments, but doing so would only emphasize how little he actually knew about the realities of special operations. He could attempt to backtrack or soften his statements, but that would make him look weak and indecisive in front of his peers. The young man with red hair, who had asked the earlier question about Jackson's experience, looked particularly uncomfortable. Sarah could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand how inappropriate their conversation had been. Unlike Jackson, who seemed motivated by bravado and a desire to establish himself as an authority figure, The redhead appeared to be genuinely thoughtful and capable of learning from his mistakes. As the silence stretched on, other personnel in the mess hall became increasingly aware of the confrontation. Conversations at nearby tables quieted as people strained to hear what was happening. Sarah was conscious of the attention but didn't let it distract her from her focus on Jackson and his companions. She knew that this moment would likely be remembered and discussed long after it was over, and she wanted to make sure that the right lessons were learned. Finally, Jackson found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his earlier confident tone. "I was just expressing my opinion," he said, his eyes darting around the table rather than meeting Sarah's steady gaze. "Everyone's entitled to their opinion, right?" Sarah nodded slowly, acknowledging his point while preparing to dismantle it. "You're absolutely right that everyone is entitled to their opinion," she said, her voice remaining calm and measured. "But there's a difference between having an opinion and making factual claims about subjects you don't understand. When you state that women can't meet the physical standards for SEAL training, you're not expressing an opinion. You're making a factual claim that happens to be wrong." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "The women who have completed SEAL training did so under exactly the same standards as every man in this community. Same physical requirements, same mental challenges, same graduation criteria. No exceptions, no accommodations, no lowered standards." "That's not opinion. That's documented fact." Jackson's face grew redder as he realized the corner he had painted himself into. "But surely you have to admit that men are generally stronger than women," he said, grasping for some way to salvage his argument. "It's just basic biology." Sarah smiled slightly, recognizing the familiar retreat to generalities that people often made when their specific arguments fell apart. "You're right that men on average have certain physical advantages," she agreed. "But SEAL training isn't about average people. It's about identifying and developing exceptional individuals regardless of their gender. The question isn't whether the average woman can meet SEAL standards. The question is whether specific women who volunteer for the program can meet those standards, and the answer, demonstrated repeatedly, is yes." She gestured around the mess hall, taking in the other personnel eating their breakfast and going about their morning routines. Every person wearing this uniform had to meet specific standards to earn their place here. Your gender, your background, your personal opinions about who belongs and who doesn't are completely irrelevant. What matters is whether you can do the job. The red-haired recruit raised his hand slightly, like a student asking permission to speak in class. Sarah nodded at him encouragingly, appreciating his apparent willingness to engage thoughtfully with the discussion. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I guess we just don't understand how it all works. We're new here, and we've heard a lot of different things from different people." Sarah's expression softened as she recognized the genuine confusion in his voice. This was the kind of honest uncertainty she could work with, unlike Jackson's confident ignorance. "That's completely understandable," she said. "There's a lot of misinformation floating around about the integration process, and it can be hard to separate fact from fiction when you're new to the community." She pulled out the chair next to the red-haired recruit and sat down, transforming the confrontation into more of a conversation. The change in her posture and tone had an immediate effect on the atmosphere at the table, reducing the tension that had been building and creating space for actual dialogue. "What's your name?" she asked the redhead, who introduced himself as Recruit Thompson. Sarah shook his hand formally, then looked around the table inviting the others to introduce themselves as well. Even Jackson mumbled his name, though he still seemed too embarrassed to make eye contact. "Here's what I want you all to understand," Sarah began, settling back in her chair. "The integration of women into special operations wasn't some political experiment or feel-good initiative. It was a recognition that the military was potentially overlooking qualified personnel based on irrelevant characteristics. The standards weren't changed to accommodate anyone. Instead, the barriers that prevented qualified women from even attempting to meet those standards were removed." She described the extensive research and planning that had preceded the policy change, including studies of female military personnel in other countries who had successfully integrated into special operations roles. The military had looked at physical performance data, psychological assessments, unit cohesion studies, and operational effectiveness metrics from around the world before implementing the changes. Thompson leaned forward, clearly interested in the details. "So there really weren't any changes to the actual requirements?" he asked. Sarah shook her head firmly. None whatsoever. The physical fitness standards, the academic requirements, the psychological evaluations, the practical skills tests. Everything remained exactly the same. If anything, the scrutiny on women going through the program has been more intense, not less, because everyone wants to make sure the standards are being maintained. She went on to explain some of the unique challenges that women faced in the integration process, challenges that actually made their achievement more impressive, rather than less so. Women had to deal with additional media attention, skepticism from some of their male colleagues, and the pressure of knowing that their performance would be seen as representative of all women rather than just themselves. Think about it this way, she said, addressing the entire table. When a male recruit fails a training evolution, nobody says that men aren't cut out for SEAL training. But when a woman fails the same evolution, there are people who will use that as evidence that no woman should be allowed to try. That's an enormous amount of pressure to perform perfectly, and the women who have succeeded have done so while carrying that additional burden. Jackson, who had been listening silently, finally spoke up again. But don't you think it changes the dynamic of the teams? He asked, his tone more respectful than before, but still carrying undertones of skepticism. I mean, having women around has to affect how men interact with each other. Sarah considered his question carefully before responding. It was actually a more thoughtful concern than his earlier comments, and she appreciated that he was at least trying to engage with the real complexities of the issue, rather than just spouting prejudices. Any change to team composition affects dynamics, she said. When you add any new person to a team, regardless of their gender, it changes how the group functions. The key is whether those changes improve or degrade performance. In my experience, mixed-gender teams often perform better than all-male teams because they bring different perspectives and problem-solving approaches to complex situations. She described some of the operational advantages that women brought to special operations missions, particularly in environments where female personnel could interact with local populations in ways that male soldiers couldn't. In many cultures around the world, traditional gender roles meant that women could gather intelligence, build relationships, and conduct operations that would be impossible for male operatives. But beyond the tactical advantages, she continued, there's a more fundamental issue at stake. The military is supposed to be a meritocracy, where advancement and opportunity are based on ability and performance rather than irrelevant characteristics. When we exclude qualified people based on their gender, we're undermining one of our core values. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. I never really thought about it that way, he admitted. I guess I just assumed that things were the way they were for good reasons. That's natural, Sarah said. We all tend to assume that existing systems make sense, especially when we're new to them. But it's important to question those assumptions and understand the reasoning behind policies and practices. Sometimes traditions persist long after the reasons for them have disappeared. She used the example of racial integration in the military, which had faced similar resistance and skepticism decades earlier. Many of the same arguments that were now being made about gender integration had been made about racial integration, with critics claiming that it would hurt unit cohesion, lower standards, and undermine military effectiveness. History had proven those concerns unfounded. The military has always been most effective when it draws from the widest possible pool of talent, she explained. Every time we've expanded that pool, we've gotten stronger, not weaker. The same thing is happening now with gender integration. As their conversation continued, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere at the table had changed completely. What had started as a confrontation had evolved into an educational discussion, with the recruits asking genuine questions and expressing real interest in understanding the issues involved. Even Jackson seemed to be listening more carefully and thinking about perspectives he hadn't considered before. Other personnel in the mess hall had gradually returned to their own conversations as the tension dissipated, though Sarah was aware that several senior NCOs and officers were still keeping an eye on their table. She knew that word of this interaction would likely spread throughout the training command, and she hoped it would be remembered as an example of how to handle disagreements professionally and constructively. The red-haired Thompson asked about her own experience going through SEAL training, and Sarah shared some of the challenges and milestones from her time in Bud/S. She described the physical demands of the program, the mental challenges that often proved more difficult than the physical ones, and the sense of accomplishment that came with earning her place on a SEAL team. The hardest part wasn't actually the physical training, she explained. It was dealing with the constant uncertainty about whether I was good enough. whether I belonged there, whether I was letting my teammates down. Every day brought new challenges and new opportunities to fail. The key was learning to focus on one evolution at a time, one day at a time, rather than getting overwhelmed by the enormity of the entire program. Jackson, who had been mostly quiet during this part of the conversation, suddenly looked up. "How did you deal with the doubt?" he asked, his earlier antagonism replaced by what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "I mean, everyone here is dealing with uncertainty about whether they're going to make it through training." Sarah appreciated the question because it revealed that Jackson was beginning to think of her as a person rather than just a symbol of policies he disagreed with. "The doubt never really goes away completely," she admitted. "Even now, after completing training and deploying operationally, I sometimes wonder if I'm measuring up to the standards expected of me. I think that's actually healthy, because it keeps me motivated to continue improving and training." She explained how she had learned to channel self-doubt into motivation rather than allowing it to become paralyzing fear. The key was to focus on preparation and performance, rather than outcomes, controlling what could be controlled and accepting that some things were beyond her influence. As their discussion drew to a close, Sarah could see that all of the recruits had been affected by their conversation. They were looking at her differently now, not as an abstract representation of controversial policies, but as an individual who had earned her place through hard work and dedication. More importantly, they seemed to understand that their own success in the program would depend on their ability to focus on their own performance rather than worrying about the qualifications of others. Sarah stood up to leave, but before she walked away, she had one final point to make to the group of young recruits who were just beginning their journey into the Special Operations community. Looking down at the table of recruits, Sarah chose her final words carefully. "I want you all to remember something important," she said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "In about 6 months, most of you won't be here anymore. The statistics don't lie. The majority of people who start SEAL training don't finish it. The ones who make it through won't be the ones who were strongest on day one, or the ones who talked the biggest game in the mess hall. They'll be the ones who focused on their own performance, supported their teammates, and refused to quit when things got difficult." She paused, making eye contact with each recruit in turn. "Every minute you spend worrying about who belongs here and who doesn't is a minute you're not spending on the preparation and mental focus you'll need to succeed. The instructors don't care about your opinions on military policy. They care about whether you can perform under pressure, whether you can be trusted by your teammates, and whether you have the character to represent this community with honor." Thompson nodded seriously, clearly taking her words to heart. "Ma'am, thank you for explaining all this to us," he said. "I know we came across as ignorant, and we probably were. This conversation has given us a lot to think about." Sarah smiled at his honesty and maturity. "We were all ignorant about a lot of things when we started," she said. "The key is being willing to learn and grow. Good luck with your training, all of you." As she walked away from the table, Sarah reflected on how the morning's confrontation had unfolded. She had seen Jackson's type before, young men who arrived at SEAL training full of confidence and preconceived notions, only to have those beliefs challenged by the reality of what the program demanded. Some of them learned and adapted, becoming better people and better operators. Others clung to their prejudices and usually found themselves eliminated from training, for reasons that had nothing to do with their physical abilities. The conversation had reminded her of her own early days in the military, when she had encountered resistance and skepticism from people who couldn't see past their own assumptions. She had learned that the most effective way to change minds was through consistent performance and professional behavior, rather than arguing or trying to prove points through confrontation. Walking back across the compound toward the training areas, Sarah passed other personnel going about their morning routines. Several nodded respectfully as she passed, and she caught snippets of conversation that suggested word of the mess hall encounter was already beginning to spread. She hoped the story would be told accurately, emphasizing the importance of focusing on performance rather than prejudice. Her own training schedule for the day included underwater demolition practice, close-quarters combat drills, and a briefing on new equipment that the teams would be testing. The work was demanding and required complete concentration, leaving little time for dwelling on social issues or political debates. This focus on practical skills and operational readiness was one of the things she loved most about special operations. Success was measured by concrete achievements rather than abstract theories. As she prepared for the day's training, Sarah thought about the message she hoped her response to Jackson had conveyed. She wanted the recruits to understand that belonging in the SEAL community wasn't about gender, background, or personal opinions. It was about demonstrating through actions that you could meet the demands of the job and be trusted by your teammates in life or death situations. The underwater training that morning was particularly challenging, involving complex navigation exercises in murky water with limited visibility. Sarah worked with her team to plant simulated explosive charges on target structures, requiring precise timing and coordination between multiple divers. The exercise demanded not just physical skill, but also mental discipline and the ability to stay calm under pressure. During a break between training evolutions, one of her longtime teammates, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, approached her. Rodriguez was a veteran of multiple deployments who had been skeptical about the integration of women into SEAL teams, but had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters after seeing her performance in combat. "Heard you had an interesting breakfast this morning," Rodriguez said with a slight smile. "Word is you handled it well." Sarah shrugged, not wanting to make too big a deal out of the encounter. "Just a bunch of kids who needed some perspective," she said. "Nothing that a little reality check couldn't handle." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Good approach. Better they learn now than wash out later because they were focused on the wrong things. I've seen plenty of recruits who spent so much time worrying about everyone else that they forgot to take care of their own training." He went on to describe some of the recruits he had observed over the years, noting how the ones who succeeded were typically those who maintained a narrow focus on their own development and performance. The ones who failed often had talent and potential but got distracted by irrelevant concerns or interpersonal conflicts that undermined their progress. "The thing about SEAL training," Rodriguez explained, "is that it's designed to reveal character under stress. All the physical preparation in the world won't help someone who doesn't have the mental toughness and integrity to push through when things get really difficult. Those recruits you talked to this morning are about to find out what they're really made of." Sarah agreed, remembering her own journey through the program and the various points where recruits dropped out or were eliminated. Some left because they couldn't meet the physical demands, but many more were removed for character issues, leadership failures, or inability to work effectively as part of a team. The program was as much about building trust and brotherhood as it was about developing tactical skills. Later that afternoon, Sarah participated in a close-quarters combat training session that simulated urban warfare scenarios. The exercise required teams to clear buildings systematically while protecting civilian populations and achieving specific mission objectives. It was the kind of complex, multifaceted training that highlighted why special operations personnel had to be thinking strategists as well as skilled fighters. During one scenario, Sarah's team had to rescue hostages from a building while neutralizing hostile forces and avoiding civilian casualties. The exercise required split-second decision-making, precise shooting skills, and seamless coordination between team members. Sarah's role involved breaching an entry point and securing a stairwell while other team members advanced through different parts of the building. The scenario unfolded with typical chaos and confusion, simulating the fog of war that characterized real combat operations. Communication between team members had to be brief and clear, with each person understanding their role and trusting others to execute theirs. Sarah moved through her assigned area methodically, checking corners and doorways while maintaining awareness of her teammates' positions and the overall mission timeline. When the exercise concluded, the instructor team conducted a detailed debrief, analyzing each phase of the operation and identifying areas for improvement. Sarah's performance was noted as particularly effective in maintaining situational awareness while executing her assigned tasks. The feedback was valuable not just for her own development but also as validation that she continued to meet the high standards expected of SEAL operators. As evening approached, Sarah found herself back in the mess hall for dinner, sitting with several of her regular teammates and discussing the day's training. The atmosphere was relaxed and professional, focused on technical aspects of their exercises and lessons learned from various scenarios. It was the kind of environment she had hoped to create through her morning conversation with the recruits, one where performance and competence were the primary concerns. About halfway through dinner, she noticed Thompson, the red-haired recruit from the morning, entering the mess hall with some of his fellow trainees. He caught her eye and nodded respectfully before moving through the serving line. Sarah was pleased to see that he appeared more confident and focused than he had that morning. suggesting that their conversation had helped him gain some clarity about his priorities. Jackson was notably absent from the group, and Sarah wondered whether he was eating at a different time or had perhaps been counseled by his instructors about his morning comments. She hoped he was taking the opportunity to reflect on the feedback he had received and consider how his attitudes might affect his progress through the program. One of her teammates, Lieutenant Commander Williams, asked about the morning's encounter after noticing her observation of the recruits. Williams was a seasoned operator who had served as a mentor to Sarah during her early days with the team, helping her navigate some of the challenges that came with being a pioneer in the community. "I heard you had a teaching moment with some of the new guys today," Williams said. "How do you think they took it?" Sarah considered the question before responding. "I think most of them were genuinely interested in learning," she said. "They were just repeating things they'd heard without really thinking about them. Once they understood the reality of the situation, they seemed pretty receptive to adjusting their perspectives." Williams nodded. "That's usually how it works with the ones who have potential," he said. "The real problems are the ones who dig in deeper when they're challenged, or who can't separate their personal opinions from professional requirements. Those guys usually wash out pretty quickly once the real pressure starts." He described his own early experiences with integration challenges in the military, noting how generational change often happened gradually as new personnel replaced older ones who had been trained in different environments. The key was ensuring that the institutional culture supported the changes and that leaders at all levels modeled appropriate behavior. "The thing I've learned about change in the military," Williams continued, "is that it happens most effectively when it's driven by operational necessity rather than external pressure. When people can see that changes make them more effective at their jobs, they tend to embrace them. When changes feel imposed from outside without clear benefits, that's when you get resistance." Sarah agreed, noting that the integration of women into special operations had been most successful in units where commanders emphasized capability and performance over demographic characteristics. Teams that focused on getting the mission done tended to adapt quickly to new personnel, regardless of their background, while units that got caught up in political or social debates often struggled with cohesion and effectiveness. As dinner wound down, Sarah reflected on how the day had unfolded and what lessons she hoped the recruits had learned. The morning's confrontation had been uncomfortable but necessary, providing an opportunity to address misconceptions before they became entrenched attitudes. More importantly, it had demonstrated that the SEAL community was willing to have difficult conversations about challenging issues. Walking back to her quarters that evening, Sarah encountered Chief Rodriguez again, who updated her on some developments related to the morning's events. Apparently, Jackson had been called in for a counseling session with his training supervisor, where he had been given some direct feedback about professional behavior and community standards. The session had reportedly been educational rather than punitive, focusing on helping him understand how his attitudes could affect his performance and relationships with future teammates. "The kid seems to be taking it seriously," Rodriguez reported. His instructor said he asked some good questions and seemed genuinely interested in doing better. "Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone needs to point out the problem before they can start working on fixing it." Dear Jackson, Sarah was pleased to hear that Jackson was responding positively to the feedback. She had seen too many promising candidates eliminated from training programs because they couldn't adapt their attitudes or behaviors to meet professional standards. The fact that he was engaging constructively with the counseling process suggested that he might have the flexibility and maturity needed to succeed. Thompson, meanwhile, had apparently impressed his instructors during the afternoon training sessions, demonstrating focus and determination that stood out even among a group of highly motivated recruits. His willingness to ask questions and acknowledge his initial ignorance about integration issues had translated into a more general openness to learning and improvement. "That's the kind of attitude that usually predicts success in this program," Rodriguez observed. "Guys who can admit when they don't know something and focus on getting better rather than trying to protect their ego. The training is designed to challenge everyone's assumptions and comfort zones, so the ones who can adapt and learn tend to do well." As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she thought about the broader implications of the day's events. The encounter with the recruits had reminded her why representation mattered, not just for its own sake, but because it provided opportunities for education and understanding that wouldn't otherwise exist. Her presence in the community meant that misconceptions and prejudices could be addressed directly rather than allowed to fester and spread. She also reflected on her own role as a role model and mentor for future generations of military personnel. Every interaction she had with junior personnel was an opportunity to demonstrate professional standards and help shape the culture of the community.